Well, many thanks to all of you for coming on this call. This is the topic of community engagement has been really important for all the congregations, I think, in certain ways. And we've asked three of you to kind of think ahead about how you have attended to the community, the wider community around your church, particularly in this calling initiative. So we sent some questions around, and I think we might just start with those and maybe go in alphabetical order by congregational name. So if anyone from Edgewood would begin, let's just start with, how did the sense of a deeper calling to the neighborhood or the community arise within your congregation? So this is really looking at the congregation's calling, like how did that sort of come to the surface? So first Edgewood, and then Holy Trinity, and then St. Matt's.
I'll go from Edgewood.
Okay, thanks, Liz.
This is something that has been simmering for us for a couple of years and came out of an all-church survey we did maybe almost 3.5 years ago. And one of our results in that survey was that there was, this desire to connect with our local community and surroundings. And we, at that time, did we were a church with a lot of ideas and a lot of opinions about what others might need. And so we, at that point, started a process of reaching out to community leaders and did some interviews of asking them questions. And we talked to like school administrators from our local public schools, some folks from the university across the way, our library director, the director of, we have a primetime older adult community program, the director of that, and asked, what is your population longing for? What are the needs there? If you could create a program that, that filled a hole that exists, or if a program were to come into fruition, what would that look like, or what would that be? They all had really specific dreams and would longing for someone else to do them, which I think is related to that. And what are the issues in your community? And so we took those and really explored those and saw, what are there overlap with our congregations, both resources and gifts and skills. And it kind of petered out from there because there was some overlap, but then we didn't really have the church leadership. But that desire to connect with the community in a deeper way has stayed, and I think has amplified during the pandemic, and seeing that we don't have a lot of centralized community. Our community center is focused towards our seniors in the community, but we don't have a gathering hub or space in our local neighborhoods for people either to gather or to find meaning in their lives or to connect with each other beyond where they work or their school groups. So we're still in the, I feel like in this iteration of it, we're in the beginning process of exploring, and we're wanting to do some listening to not just the institutions in the community, but our neighbors in the neighborhood, and have been thinking, how can we engage either like a survey that would, put out through social media, through the neighborhood groups and neighborhood presidents to reach people to see, what are you guys longing for at this time? What do you need? We're all right here. So we're still exploring.
That is so rich. I just want to underscore a couple things you said that stick out to me, is going from the idea to moving on the idea, like we should reach out to our community, to actually doing something, going from having your ideas about what people needed to listening. And then what I thought was a really interesting turning point was you were listening for some overlap of resources you might have and skills that might be in the congregation. And initially you didn't have the leadership, but the calling didn't stop during the time when you were kind of like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. But in the pandemic, like something lit a fire and you started moving again. And I think also the distinction between working with institutions around you and working with neighbors was a really interesting topic that you raised. So thank you so much. This is, I'm feeling like I'm seeing all the congregations I've ever worked for, like show up in things that you're saying. But you know, some of these were places where we stopped and could not figure out our way, but you've kept it going, and that's really interesting. Marcia, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think Liz summed it up beautifully.
Yeah, it's pretty great. Thank you. Okay. Holy Trinity.
Hi, it's Anne.
Yeah.
I would say that Holy Trinity has had a very long history of engaging with its surrounding neighborhood on many different levels, from providing affordable housing near the church, building 2 facilities, to opening our building to partners from the community. Metro Workforce is a group that's been with us for over 40 years and provides daycare for developmentally challenged adults. We have a preschool cooperative that meets in our building, and we also have a partnership with the Minnesota Swahili congregation using our facilities. So these are programs that have been a part of our identity for the last many decades. I would say that really some of our most important work began shortly after the election in 2016, when we saw many of our neighbors near us who were finding themselves to be targets of our government. Our Somali neighbors, our Hispanic neighbors, our African American neighbors, all living in very close proximity to us in South Minneapolis. We began to see that their existence was being threatened. And I feel like some of those actions that we took at that point to stand as allies with those folks began before our relationship with the Communities of Calling initiative. Since that time, because of the uprising following George Floyd's murder this last May, we quickly became I think a uniting force in the neighborhood that welcomed protesters who were there speaking out for justice. We served as a shelter, being just a couple of blocks away from the 3rd precinct where a lot of the riots happened. So we served as a medical aid station, a shelter for protesters, and then days afterward, I still don't know how this decision was made, but it just seemed to sort of flow organically. We became this food distribution center because grocery stores, pharmacies were all destroyed in the neighborhood. So people had nowhere to get their drug prescriptions filled, to get their milk and bread and produce. And I think it was at that point that we really began to have this sense that we were beginning to live inside out as a community of faith, that we were connecting with our neighbors in a multitude of new ways. We had opportunities to hear from and meet and connect with neighbors that would never walk in our doors for a church service, but were absolutely linked with us in this struggle for justice. And so I think our congregation as a whole has experienced a brand new awakening of what it means to be church and what it means to be God's people who are trying to respond to the needs of our neighbor. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that journey with us. It's really meant a lot to all of us who, have been hearing your stories along the way. And I think some of the things I just want to pull out of what you said was this long history of attending to the neighborhood means that people come to your congregation because they have a call. Like there's a match of calls, and this is pretty fundamental to your identity as a congregation. So I think that's really important. And then I noticed like these shifts in the context, like in 2016, when this anti-immigrant voice started to become very predominant and started to threaten your neighbors and their businesses and all of that, you all really respond. Like you have kind of a history of attending to your context, so like you responded. And then when it got so dire, at the time of George Floyd's murder and the aftermath, like clarity just kind of came. Like I love it, the fact that you said, I don't know how this decision was made, but it's almost like the whole congregation was a single body that felt this thing, and this food thing happened, the support for people happened, and then this becoming a food center, and these things like just rose up, and there wasn't a question. I think that's really interesting to watch how a group of people can have that kind of sudden clarity, like we have to do this. They had a history of a common call. So I think all these are factors, but that's a really interesting and beautiful thing to see happen. And then I just, life inside out. I feel like I just want to put that on my wall and live with that for a while. Thank you. St. Matt's. So Kelly, Benjamin.
Sure. I think it takes all three of us to tell the story because we have three very different perspectives on our team.
Yeah, Lynn.
So, Lynn, will you start us off as the one who's known the place where the church has been for a long time?
Oops, Lynn, you're on mute.
We're geographically situated in a suburb that is very close, relatively close to downtown Louisville, and one of the first suburbs outside of Louisville. And the suburb was actually named after the church. The church was there first. And so we're really a fixture there, and most everybody in the area is very familiar with the church. We have an unusual roof. We have a tent-shaped roof. And when it first was built, it was a copper roof, and then it went through the transformation. And I can remember my grandmother driving me by and talking about how the roof was going to change color and so on. In addition to that, the place has been a rite of passage for many people in the direct neighborhood, climbing the roof and hanging out as teenagers, and back in the day, the place to smoke and this, that, and the other. So I think we sort of have two places that are rooted in the community. One is the physical structure, and then the other is that we've always been considered the most progressive Episcopal church in really the state, but certainly in the city. And so we have a couple of claims to fame. We have this piece of green space in the middle of St. Matthew's, and then we also have the reputation of being very active with social justice and outreach.
Thanks. So I came to St. Matthew's 6 years ago, and we already had people on boards all over the city. We already knew politicians. We expected that we had a public voice, and so that was already established. And most of the congregation doesn't live in the city of St. Matthews. And so figuring out how to connect with our neighborhood or what I could possibly do that would be new was a challenge because I don't live here in this city. There was a Buddhist temple that was kind of new across the street that nobody knew anything about. Very curious about how this Jehovah's Witness church was transformed into a Buddhist temple. And so we talked about many meetings. And then one day I just walked across the street and I met the monks who do not speak English. And they, through their translator, had me over for tea. I was terrified that it was going to be yak's milk tea, but it was not. It was regular tea, and served me Oreo cookies and bought flowers at Kroger and set them up on a card table. And that's how we became friends with our neighbors across the street. So that has been life-giving for the parish. The bishop gives the monks communion when he comes. It's quite the exception for him. And it's caused us to ask questions about who else is in our neighborhood. And of course, Benjamin lives in our neighborhood. So he's picked up the next, our year two for our grant proposal.
So yeah, and I think the story of how we've sort of, as far as the Communities of Calling project engaged our neighborhood, started with last year. We found that there were people that were not members of the church that were becoming regulars at some of our events, specifically the skill sharing classes, and then they were inviting their friends. And so in these events where, you're learning to bake bread, but you're also having a pretty in-depth conversation about one person's calling to bake bread. And so people were attracted to that, and that made us wonder, where else are people interested in talking about calling in our community? And so I live on camp. I live here on the church grounds in the rectory. And so we noticed that there's always people in our green space eating lunch or having their dogs or having meetings or whatever. And so we are interested in starting conversations with them. And then we also sort of, for the people that are like having lunch here, we wondered who in our area works near us. And so that's sort of a lot of what we planned for this year, was based on who's just right around us already.
Thank you all so much. I think your story is really helpful for a lot of congregations, and some of the things that I hear that make me smile are just this curiosity that you all have. So Lynn has been there a long time, and she tells a story that is sort of like the neighbors have also been curious about you, and you have been curious. Now you are really curious about them, and there's this kind of beautiful meeting around that, and that there's just a lot of joy in discovery. I guess it makes me think of something my liturgy professor said to me in seminary, or said to our class, that at the passing of the peace, you greet the neighbor that God gives you. And I feel as though you all are really opening up the treasure of the neighbors that God has given you. And it's really beautiful. Thank you so much. Let's move to, I think you all have kind of talked about how you're developing relationships. I want to be sure that we have time for you to be asked some other questions. So let's look at question 3 that we had. What have you learned so far about callings from these relationships? And some of you are having calling conversations with the groups that you're connecting with. So if so, what language are you using, or what are you hearing from them? Or what language do you plan to use if you're just starting to reach out like that to your neighbors? So does that spark something in one of you?
When in thinking about language we would use reaching out, we would probably use the language of like meaning and purpose. and where folks are finding meaning or finding purpose, and what that looks like, or where they need support in that, where they're struggling to find that, which feels a little different than calling. And partly, like, yeah, I'd just love to hear other examples into a broader, folks who are, a lot of our neighbors, you know, turned off by anything as soon as it sounds faith-based.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious about when, you know, you all are going to be engaging a community conversation, which in a way is about, so you might explain what that will involve. And I'm interested, it's kind of like asking your whole neighborhood to ask the question, what kind of a neighborhood are we called to be? Or how are we to be neighbors to each other?
Sure. So one of the plans that we have for year 2 is that in light of everything that's happened in our immediate neighborhood, we want to invite community leaders, educational leaders, business owners, city leaders to talk about what is it that's unique about this community that seemed to suffer so much this summer. What is it that makes the Longfellow community or South Minneapolis such a tapestry of beautiful people and beautiful spirits? And so one of the ideas that Pastor Ingrid had, who is on parental leave, by the way, that's why she's not with us today. One of the ideas that she had, and that I know she's thinking very deeply about, is hosting some community conversations for these people via Zoom to have conversation about how do we want to rebuild this neighborhood. And I think one of the main premises for having that conversation is realizing that we belong to each other, regardless of our faith, regardless of our culture, the languages that we speak. We've realized in the course of the riots and the uprising how the people who showed up to speak out for justice are from every country, every age group, every educational background, every economic level. I think we've experienced this commonality that we are not alone, that we belong to each other, we can help each other, we can stand together. And I think that sort of forms the basis for these community conversations that we hope to have this year. So I know Pastor Ingrid has already, she's gathered together the business owners that she had developed relationships prior to the pandemic, prior to George Floyd, in our immediate area. And I think she said the other day that there were maybe 30 or 35 folks on the last call that she had. They're now making decisions about how they will communicate as a unified voice to members of the Minneapolis City Council about decisions that they're making regarding rebuilding efforts. They've got a postcard campaign that I think we'll hear more about later, saying the Longfellow community wants to be part of your ongoing conversations about what is the future of this neighborhood. And so that will play into the community conversations that we have later this fall.
It's really interesting to hear how calling is showing up under completely other language. Like, what is the meaning? What did you say? What is the future of this neighborhood is a meaning and purpose question, or it's a calling question as you might understand it, but people face those questions, whatever language they give to it.
Yeah, I would also say, Jane, that what our own membership has, what I've been hearing from folks in our own congregation during this time is this question that each of us has about what we can do to bring about change, to be part of an effort to bring the components of systemic racism finally under scrutiny, so that we can collectively work together to erase this. So each of our members is asking that question in their own way, and it has a lot to do, it's a very immediate question about our own calling. So what action will we take? So I find that really opens a door for further conversation. If you're asking, how can I make a difference here? Then you're going to begin to ask the kinds of questions about, what is God's purpose for me? Am I listening? Am I paying attention? All those kinds of questions then will be part of that ongoing thinking, I think.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. St. Matt's, you all have, you've got some conversations planned with your neighbors. And so what do you think, what are you going to be trying out? You might describe kind of what you're doing. You have a little bit, but.
So one of our plans is to reach out, or this is sort of an idea we had before the pandemic, clearly. We were going to approach the businesses around us. There's a grocery, there's like a garden center, there's both like large corporations and also small family-owned things, and to sort of talk to the leadership and say, hey, could we bring a meal or lunch to a few of your employees and have a conversation about if they feel called to the work they're doing or how they would describe the calling that they're doing. The language we were hoping to use, I think in Kentucky, people are just kind of comfortable with there being an underlying religious language. So the word calling, I don't think people even associate with religion, just because we're in the Bible Belt and there's lots of religious language. So we'll probably use the word calling. I think we're going to try and treat it kind of like, present it like a research project. We want to make it very clear that we're not wanting to talk to your employees so that they'll start coming to our church. And so whatever language accomplishes that is what we're going for. And we're going to, our way of getting feedback from this, our plan is just to have one of our team members present and in those conversations. And then as soon as they leave that meal, to write a bunch of notes. We don't want to make people fill out like the normal things that we would get feedback from our own parish, which work great. We feel a little odd about giving a survey to someone that we're just visiting in their space while we bring them meal. And so that's our plan, if that's what you meant. And as far as talking to our neighbors, I think I'm just gonna like walk up to them while they're playing basketball and talk to them, sort of. Well,
I want to share with the rest of the group the fact that you did ask, was it okay to get a picnic table with the funds? And I said yes, because you're planning to sit at the picnic table and have conversations that you couldn't have if you didn't have it.
It's not the same as leaning against a tree, yeah.
Lynn, I see that you're unmuted. Were you going to add something?
You know, there was something that was sort of interesting that happened when we switched our inside food pantry to outside due to need. And, you know, we didn't really want to do it, but we figured out how to do it, and our visibility in the community really rose. And it had maybe never occurred to me that the difference between driving by our church and seeing hundreds of cars on the third Saturday of the month was very different than seeing bodies outside. The other thing that happened the first month or two, it was safer to do our drive-by food pantry than it was to go to the grocery. So our mix of people who came was even broader than usual, because we're no questions asked food pantry anyway. But there were certainly lots of physical neighbors that drove through because they were afraid to go in a Kroger. So I wouldn't have thought of ahead of time that that would have been people are so numb to, you know, their surroundings. I mean, we're a stone's throw from a Target, and oftentimes I'll use that as our geographic, you know, spot. But, you know, you can drive past a building over and over and over and over and over and not even notice it. So sometimes if you shake things up a little bit and all of a sudden they're handing out food in your front parking lot, then people see you differently. And so it's one of the benefits that came out of this whole chapter.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I'm wondering, let's pause as we're kind of at the halfway point. I want to be sure that those of you who've joined the call who are not kind of leading here have a chance to either add something to the conversation or ask a question of somebody who's spoken. Because all of you are engaged in different ways. Yeah, Rachel?
I just wanted to say, like, to Anne and the folks at Holy Trinity, like the work you're doing on the ground, in my opinion, would be the most important work, but you might not even realize just because Ingrid has put some, like a little video on social media and some things like that, like my connection in another country to hearing the news of what happened in your city and not knowing what I could do to help and also feeling really bad about it, I felt like this is like a news source I can trust, but also like this is what the church is supposed to be doing. And then I was able to even say to my friends in Minneapolis, like, I heard they need a thing and you're trying to figure out how to help. So it's just it's interesting to me, especially now in this world where there's so much online, that there's the ripple effects to helping me understand what's going on and figuring out a small thing to do because you've had that extra piece out there.
Thank you. That's good to hear.
It's interesting you're raising up how personal the online presence actually is. It can be very person to person, really significant. Yeah. Others?
I love that question around what does it mean to live inside out? You know, at a time when actually the only folks who are in our building right now is a ministry that we have a partnership with, Mindful Works, which is a job training program in fabric arts business for folks who are recovering from mental illness. And they're really important to us. It's actually a priority that we discerned in going through figuring out community engagement. But this whole, so how can we use the outside of our building in some ways to be a witness in the wider community? And how do we, you know, move down the street? I just think it's a really intriguing question to reflect on. We live Pine Street, where First Congregational is on Church Row. So there's our church, there's the ELCA church, there's the Episcopal Church, there's the United Methodist Church, there's the Baptist Church, all right in a row. And there's very little that we have done together. I mean, the only thing that we have done that we do together at this point is that on Palm Sunday, our congregations come together for a donkey parade and combined choir at 10 o'clock, and then we all disperse to go to our houses of worship for Palm Sunday. But the United Methodist pastor is new. I just had coffee with him last week, and he's coming from Indianapolis, where he was really engaged in the wider community. And so I'm really looking to continue the relationship with him and to learn about what that might look like in our community. And the ELCA congregation is about to call a new pastor. So it feels like there are some new opportunities for us to really begin to explore how do we, especially in this time, live outside of our buildings. So it's just an intriguing question to reflect on. I have a few other thoughts, but I just want to sit with the question.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Often when we think of the resources of the buildings that the church has. We're thinking about the insides, right? Do I have a room where that could happen? We don't think about the exterior, but that's a really important piece of embodiment, right?
Yeah, yeah. I
So
mean, in the time when, I mean, usually we share our building with 40 organizations, but they're all meeting on Zoom right now, or they're finding other ways to meet because it's not safe to be in person. But we're about to set up some. One of the things that we're working on right now is creating some educational pods in our building, small groups of kids, 6 kids with 1 mentor, so that as they are all at computers doing school online, they also have some company in a way that's safe. So they get the social piece, they get the friendship piece, they get the extra help, which parents are not always the best people to be teaching their kids. But we're also going to be setting up a big tent in our parking lot so they can have lunch outside. And so it's going to become a very visible thing in the neighborhood. And I'm just curious to see what will happen around all that.
yeah, absolutely. The fourth question is, how are these relationships affecting your congregation's sense of its calling? Which I think is a really interesting thing, that we get changed by these relationships. We're not the same. I'm using we as the congregation, change who we are on account of these other relationships. Someone want to speak to that?
That question resonates with me, in part because the Buddhist temple and St. Matthew's are in a similar place. Like, we're expected to kind of speak as a Louisville authority, not really as a City of St. Matthew's authority, but we have a plan in place, and I'm so happy for everything that you've shared, because it's going to help us. When the Attorney General, we expect the Attorney General not to deliver favorable news about Breonna Taylor's case and the police officers. And so the night that happens, the Buddhist monks are as distanced as us. We're planning to have a candlelight vigil and not tell anyone about it. And so we'll be a candlelight vigil on both sides of the street. There won't be protests in St. Matthew's, very likely, unless they move really far from downtown. But we've decided that we have to have a presence in the city of St. Matthew's. And so for that night, the prayer service will be on our own grounds.
That's beautiful, thank you. And it will involve the neighbors that the friends that you've made in your neighborhood. Others?
I think for Edgewood, even the process of thinking about who our neighbors are and what the needs are has grounded us more outside of our individual, like what we come to church to get, but grounded us as part of a wider identity. And I've heard, even just in the last, so two of the issues that were raised as like gaps in our local community were very different and weren't anything that any of our members had considered, because very few of our members were directly impacted by them. And since then, like, it's on our radar, like people have noticed things differently, or they bring up of like, did you see the high school, filled this need and how great, and they're serving the youth. And so there's like a different level of investment in sort of what's going on and bringing the news of the community back into the church, which is great.
It's almost a real shift in identity, right? From the church and others to a more porous edge. Mm-hmm. Who are we? Yeah.
And I'd say, and people being able to bring more of themselves to the church. Like, they don't have to leave their like we've developed a really strong relationship with the elementary school that's 2 blocks away. That was actually the original place where our church met before we had a building, 60 years ago, with their equity team. And we have a couple of members of the church who are on that equity team. And before, like, we started asking questions or showing up or supporting their work, they didn't think to talk about it at church. And now we see is more like a community partner. So they can more fully bring their passion and their work and commitment into the church community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. I'm curious, there's several people here from St. Mark's, and I'm interested in what you all are thinking as you listen.
Jane, the conversation takes me back, I think, to what Anne spoke of, and Rachel, be church, be neighbor, and that very powerful Visio Divina of Pastor Ingrid walking around that neighborhood and the church during the tragedy in Minneapolis. And so that's, as I hear the conversation, it takes me back to that visual importance within the community of what was happening.
I keep thinking about all the things that you guys are giving us, all sorts of ideas of what we can do in our community. And this is great. And I was thinking, Benjamin and Kelly, about, and Liz, what you guys were doing, or not Liz, someone else in your group, Marcia.
Lynn.
And what you guys are doing and going into businesses and talking to them. And I'll be curious to see how that works, and how, have you tried that at all yet, or are you just getting started with that?
We have not. And in fact, it may be some time.
Right.
We figure out how to bring a meal to someone. So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love that idea. So I'll be curious to hear how that goes.
Similarly, actually, the idea of when you called it a research project, that was a new term. I just hadn't thought of it that way before, but I really like that idea. And then also looking at ways to leverage the grounds of the church, not just the inside of the building. I know that's a really easy thing to look at. Yeah, and it's interesting too, like, Liz, you talked about this, the way that at first you kind of like come up with a plan to look outward, but then like the way that actually as going through that, looking at the community outward, how the views shift. And just kind of, I think it takes a lot of deliberation to be open to that change in the views and being aware of when one's view of community is changing.
Do you think most of the communities, I'm thinking again, the conversation, that the appearance that church is not closed? We are all very active out in our communities in these new ways of being scattered. Is that, we are not closed.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see what God is up to. So much is shifting here, and how much when we feel that call to reach out into the neighborhood, like we become changed utterly. Like we are, there's no subject and object, like everybody's being acted upon by everybody else, and we're completely changed.
Yeah.
Chris?
I was just thinking, I mean, this whole concept of living inside out, as I think about all the ways that we're living our lives as the church right now, I mean, in everything that we do, in worship, in our learning, in our meetings, it's all happening outside of the structures that we usually have. We're learning, and we're really asking ourselves the question, what are we learning during this time that we're going to continue to carry forward? Because I don't think that we're going to go back and be the same that we were before. So how can we really be reflective about what we're learning right now that we want to maintain, you know, in every part of our life together.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You're muted, Chris.
We've been doing reflection on, you know, liminal seasons. What's a liminal season? What does it mean to be living in liminality, which is defined both by uncertainty and by possibility. It's a time of both a lot of anxiety, but also innovation. So how do we, in this space, which is so much about liminality, both with COVID and with the racial reckoning, how can we live in that place of possibility and innovation and learning?
And liminality is an actual place.
Yeah.
You know, like we treat it as though it's no place, because it's not where we've been and it's not where we're going, but it's an actual place. Like, it's a very rich place to be. Right?
Yeah. It's the wilderness, and it's the wilderness.
Yeah. Yeah, and notice like they keep trying to solve it in the wilderness, right? They keep trying.
And they spend a lot of time being lost, you know, 40 years in the wilderness, but actually, you know, it's not that far from Egypt to
no, maybe it just felt like 40 years.
Right, it felt like a really long time, but what happened to them in the wilderness, I mean, they were formed as a community. They learned how to worship in new ways. This motley group of Hebrew slaves became a people that moved forward into the future.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened again in exile, and certainly the same thing happened again in the ministry of Jesus. You know, his death, but it turned out not to be the end. The church was formed out of that. So actually, I just ran across a quote the other day that says that the entire biblical story, the whole thing, is about liminality.
Yeah, I can see us all like absorbing that.
Yeah.
It's really powerful. Those are powerful reminders of our story, our faith story.
We were made for times like this. I don't know. I mean, really, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I'm really hoping that this is, I know we all are, that this time of racial reckoning, that we're going to make some changes that will make a difference. We've been spending a lot of time as a congregation the last few weeks. It feels like a long time, but it's really only been a few weeks, where we're really, several of us are really immersed in looking at systemic inequality and what that means. And it's the pervasiveness of it feels very heavy. And we've been, you know, there are people in our congregation who want to say, so what can we do? How can we fix this? And we're saying, no, stay in this place, in the discomfort of this place, and see how we are being changed and what we can live into in a new way. So slow down and pay attention.
Christina, I have a goal not to do away with any white guilt that does no earthly good. It's a long-term goal, because St. Matthew's is like social justice, a bunch of guilty white liberals all the time. So this has been a really exciting moment for me to see just the beginnings of some of those actual changes. Like the letters that we've been writing to the mayor for the last 6 years, there's movement on some of those small things. And I don't know, I thank you for saying what you did, because you connected me with where I've been and helped me realize that, oh my gosh, I'm sure I'll return there, but for the moment, I think things are happening.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Anne, I think we're all going to be watching and listening to what happens, what that conversation and the vision of what the community can be after coming out of something so brutal and heartbreaking and heart-wrenching. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really inspiring. You know, we move to certain communities because of the identity that they have. And now this community, this neighborhood has the possibility to name the beautiful things that were part of this neighborhood, and then to not just reclaim those things, but to expand on those things as the neighborhood is rebuilding. So I too am really, it's hard to say this, but in the midst of this devastation, it's as if there's all this new life that's coming up out of the ground all over the place. And it's really exciting to be part of that. I would also say that all of your comments have helped me think about what happens now for us as we've been very visible on the exterior of our building with this food distribution effort. That will come to a close here at the end of August. We'll be partnering with some other food organizers, food providers over the fall and winter months to keep those supplies coming, but we will not be heading up that effort any longer. But it makes me think about this visibility piece that I think our neighborhood will still need to see us working alongside them. And what will that look like? How can we still be present physically in the community to inspire others to stand together? So you've prompted some good thinking here, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's sticking in my mind from what Chris was saying is in all those various kinds of liminal and wilderness and experiences of trial, God was making a new people. And that's what I keep hearing over and over again here is we're in this process of being made into a new people that includes other people. It's more porous to others who are changing us, and what a good thing. Any last questions, thoughts? Jessie, do you have a question or thought you want to be sure to get in?
This has just been so rich, and the prepositions that Kathleen offered kind of as a framework are really coming to mind for me as I listen to your stories. I mean, being called out of particular experiences that your individual communities are having, being called within the history of your particular geographic area, community, city. And I mean, that's the relationship piece that is so strong. And I'm just grateful that we're able to have these kind of theological conversations, as well as some of the practical, here are ideas for your projects. But I just felt some good energy today around what it means to be part of a community. And I'm glad for the concepts of vocation and calling to kind of offer that foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, I see that Jessie's recording this, so if you want to go back over this at some point, and others will be able to share it later. So thank you so much for participating in this. It has been so rich. I want to close out with this piece of the Rule of St. Benedict that we've been reading lately. I think it kind of goes to what we've been doing. What can be sweeter to us, dear ones, than this voice of our God inviting us? Behold, in loving kindness, Christ shows us the way of life. May our path this day be in the way of life, and may it be together. Amen.
Amen.
Great. Thank you all for being with us.
Yes.
We'll be back same time, same place next Wednesday for a conversation on vocation interviews or vocation sermons. So we'd welcome you, and again, anyone else from your larger teams that may want to join, you're most welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, each and all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Peace.
Peace.
Bye, everybody.